Okay, it's 7:30. We'll get started. This is an informal presentation. We'll gavel the committee in here a little later than that, but the Petroleum Association of Wyoming has graciously agreed to come in and give us an update on oil and gas in Wyoming, which is fantastic. Thank you. And that they'll introduce themselves. A few reminders. We're still under kind of the rules that I've set for committee. Silence your cell phones, keep the extraneous noise down, keep the decorum of the meeting. And I will go over some more when we gavel in for our regular meeting. So with that, Pete, Colin, Tom, it's all yours. And if you're not speaking, if you would shut off your microphone to keep the feedback down. So thanks. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Good morning, members of the committee. Just working through a little technical glitch here so that the folks online might be able to see the slides, and then we'll get going. I think we're good. It is indeed on the TV. Perfect. All right. Well, good morning, members. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the invitation to do this, and thank you all for getting up so early to talk about Wyoming's primary economic driver, the oil and gas industry. My name is Pete Obermueller. I'm the president of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming, and to my left is Colin McKee. Colin is my regulatory affairs director for the association. Colin manages everything that happens under the EPA and the Department of Interior, so he has nothing to do. And to my right is Mr. Tom Van Cleef. Mr. Van Cleef is on my board of directors. He is a small operator. He's not small. His operation is somewhat small in just outside of Casper, and you'll hear from him a little bit later. I'm going to try to make sure that I leave lots of time for Tom because he's who I want you to hear from. So real briefly, Mr. Chairman, just in case you're wondering, if you don't already know, recognize the last name, of course, my dad is the Republican caucus chair, so we can just set that aside right off the bat. We are related. And I'm just a Casper kid. My parents and my dad still live in the house I grew up in. I graduated from Natrona County High School, and then I did some other things, but then had the privilege of working on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for then Representative Cynthia Lummis, handling public lands and energy issues in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the people of Wyoming. So it was a real privilege. And then I've been doing this job here for just about 4 years. So what I want to do this morning, Mr. Chairman, with that is talk a little bit about my membership, who we're talking about, and then there's part of the reason of having the slides, which I've provided for you so you can easily see them, is just to sort of keep me on track, because quite frankly, everything I say today and every single slide has about 15 to 50 things underneath it that could warrant an hour-long briefing in and of themselves. It's a complicated business with lots going on, and quite frankly, is very diverse in Wyoming. So the Petroleum Association has around 170, 175 members, ranging from the largest operators that operate in Wyoming, names you would recognize like Continental, Occidental, Devon Energy, those sorts of things, Exxon. And then down to companies like Tom's, Oil Mountain Energy, and others. Also represent midstream, your pipelines and your gathering systems, and how we, as one of the top exporters of energy in the United States, get the resource that we produce here and get it to everywhere else that needs it, uses it, and likes to complain about it. And then also refineries, and then everybody who orbits the space. So there's so much that happens in order to get the resource out of the ground that requires contractors, oil field service operators, wildlife biologists, engineers, petroleum engineers, attorneys, all those things to try to make it happen. All told, in terms of direct employment, is around 12,000 people or so in Wyoming are employed by the oil and gas industry. And if you multiply that into indirect and all of those, it gets quite a lot bigger, but that's pretty much the direct. We also have we're also actively participants in the community. And I just wanted to mention real briefly before I move on that one of the things Petroleum Association does is every year we designate a priority partner, somebody in or an organization in a community that is doing good work on behalf of those people. And we try to direct some of our charitable giving to them. Last year, that program was the Wyoming Stewardship Program under Ag in the Classroom. If you don't have the Wyoming Stewardship Program in your elementary schools in your districts, you really should seek it out. It's a program for fourth through sixth grade that teaches the kids about our top 3 industries in Wyoming: minerals, travel and tourism, and agriculture. It aligns to state standards and has all sorts of hands-on activities for teachers. It's an amazing program. This year, we are supporting the Science Zone in Casper. If anybody have been to the Science Zone in Casper, again, an amazing museum, hands-on activities that focuses on Wyoming's resources and helps kids of all ages understand it a little bit better. It's our priority partner for 2023. Okay, let's get into it. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a status report and then talk a little bit about some of the things that are not necessarily in your control, the BLM and the EPA, and some of the things that are going on there. Then I'll try to spend the bulk of the time on things that are in your control, things that this committee will focus on, and probably will have to focus on this session, and we'll focus on in the interim for certain and in the coming years. But to start off, we'll just take a little status check. This week we have 21 rigs running in the state, 9 in Converse County and 6 in Campbell. That, of course, is the Powder River Basin. Powder River Basin is the sweet spot for oil and gas, well, for oil, particularly in Wyoming. That is the basin where there's the most exploration, the most activity, and what we produce from the Powder River Basin is a quality of product that is desirable. And that's why many companies are focused there. Then, of course, there's 2 down here in Laramie County. It hasn't been that long ago that there really was no activity in Laramie County. Technology in drilling and particularly horizontal drilling has allowed companies to unlock the northern DJ Basin in Laramie County. And so now Laramie County is the 3rd largest producer of oil in the state. That is a very new phenomenon. There's 2 in Sublette County, and those, of course, real briefly, are the Western Wyoming gas fields. Those are true gas fields. They are drilling for gas. They want the gas. In a lot of places, particularly in the Permian Basin in Texas and others, the gas is a byproduct. It's secondary, called associated gas. They're not drilling for it. They don't necessarily want it. What they want is the oil. Our Western Wyoming gas fields have a comparative advantage because they're actually drilling for and want the gas. And that allows them to focus on drilling in a way, drilling for gas in a way that is sustainable and that produces gas in a way that our large West Coast markets want to have it. So I just put up there our currently number of producing wells in Wyoming and then idle wells. I'm not going to spend any time on that because I want Mr. Van Cleef to talk a little bit about wells. He's going to spend some time on that. So here's how production has been looking. The orange line is gas production. The blue line is oil production since January of 2020. Obviously, that big dip, you'll remember for obvious reasons. Oil production in Wyoming has rebounded to a certain degree. It's not back to where it was in 2019, though nationally we are coming back and are pretty close to where we were in 2019. We hit a peak in the United States of oil production in 2019, and it's projected that we will hit and surpass that peak in 2023. Rumors of our demise are greatly exaggerated. So let's talk a little bit. There's no labels on the X and Y.
Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Obermueller, but
No problem.
On that last slide, our natural gas production continues to decline.
Yep.
And seeing the forecast that the state has put out for natural gas prices for the next foreseeable future, it still looks economical. It looks very economical for natural gas. I just wondered if you could expand why we're not seeing more robust return of rigs to the natural gas drilling environment.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, great question, and it's just the most perfect segue to my next slide. So just the short answer to your question, the direct answer to your question, I'll explain it a little bit, is in part because of the dramatic decline curve in the production of wells after they are first drilled and then over the life of it. So I'll explain that a little more, and that will partly answer your question, though not totally answer your question. So we'll try to do that. So this is a little bit of a stylized drawing of what, true for oil, also true for gas, about how production looks. So this has policy implications for you all, particularly as it relates to taxes and some other things. Plugging and abandoning and those sorts of things is how much production happens in the first 6 months to a year of production. So that green line is basically indicates how much is flowing from the well. It flows naturally at first, and then artificial lift. Those are, of course, the pump jacks that you see that are pulling the resource up out of the ground, and that the amount of production is so high in the first 6 to 12 months that it almost captures. It sometimes can capture half to 3/4 of the production of the well right there in that first time, and then it trails off significantly over the rest. So there's no hard and fast rule, but you can that initial big production happens right away. So to Representative Heiner's question, when you have a situation, whether it's for economics or for governmental reasons or whatever, that rigs are laid down, and they're laid down for more than a year, then simply replacing those rigs lost after a year or a year and a half, you can see how much that production curve has fallen off that cliff. And it takes more than just replacement rigs to get it back up at that point. We're way behind the decline curve. It also indicates why we are always so concerned. People ask why are you so concerned about leases and sort of getting out ahead of leasing and permitting and all of that? That's part of it too. We have to have that continual ability to explore and to drill and produce in order to stay ahead of that decline curve, so that the production can stay high. So moving down that decline curve, later on, it could be 20 years, could be 30 years down the line, you get into the situation where you're in the possibility for enhanced oil recovery. Enhanced oil recovery is, of course, going back into a producing field, a legacy field, injecting those wells with could be water, could be carbon, could be something else that helps to stimulate that well and delay when you need to plug and abandon for economic reasons. You can really increase your production in enhanced oil recovery. Wyoming has an organization called the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute that does a lot of research in this field, and they're an excellent organization that I encourage you to hear from at some point. I know Mr. Chairman will probably take care of that.
Yes, Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Obermueller, kind of maybe dovetailing a little bit, and I appreciate the explanation on some of these oil wells, but I guess I was a little surprised when I only saw there's 2 rigs up and running in the anticline. I checked, and just given where Opal prices are and the demand for that nat gas, I'm kind of surprised that there's only 2 versus more. Given, is it still not economical for them to stand more rigs up at that price, or what's?
Yeah,
Mr. Obermueller, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Representative Western, it's a great question, and I honestly can't adequately answer it for you, because each of those the 2 main companies, there's several out there, but the 2 biggest ones are Jonah and Pure West, and they're they each have one of those rigs, and we were without a rig in the Jonah Field and Pinedale anticline for I want to say 3 years maybe prior to the pandemic, and then there was the pandemic. So there is some sense, and we'll talk about a little bit later, about the ability to continue to drill on public lands, and that creates some uncertainty. The price, it wasn't, you probably heard me say in the last 2 sessions that I don't think we'll ever see $4 gas ever again. And here we are. So lesson learned, never say never. But I don't think that there's a really high degree of confidence that we're going to stay at that price, and we've already seen at some of that come back down. So I know that's not a very satisfactory answer. If you got in a room with those guys, they could tell you more about how they're looking at the economics.
Mr. Chairman, so it sounds like it's kind of a, sustain return versus economics of getting these rigs up and all that stuff kind of trade-off, what it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Van Cleef wants to offer a couple remarks. Introduce yourself, Tom, and then go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, my name is Tom Van Cleef. I am, at this point in time, a very small operator. My entire company is here in Cheyenne. My wife is back in the hotel room. It's the two of us. We are a mom and pop. That said, and I'll brag on my wife a little bit. She's second generation oil field. My introduction to the oil and gas industry was Target photos in the first Gulf War. So I've learned a lot from her. And she's probably one of the best petroleum engineers I've ever met. One of the best engineers I've ever worked with in 40 years. Learning from her, the biggest issue we've got right now with not only the gas exploration, but the oil exploration is the uncertainty. And it's not just the uncertainty of where the prices are going to be. A lot of the larger operators who have the wherewithal to be able to drill have to rely on outside capital. And the capital is not going to flow into our industry under the current environment. When you have a U.S. representative from the state of New York saying that a gas stovetop causes brain damage, that has a negative effect on the willingness of capital to come in. And it's not cheap to drill a well. And the decline curve on a gas well is a lot steeper than the decline curve on an oil well. Oil wells can flow down the food chain to folks at my end of the gene pool. And we can keep folks pumping oil wells at 4 to 5 gallons a week. To do that with a gas well is a lot more challenging. So I think I hope that helps explain why, even though the price of gas right now is up and the market for gas is up, and all of the large economic indicators say that we should be very economic. I think you're seeing this not only in Wyoming, but you're going to see it across the industry for the near-term future, is that uncertainty because of the regulatory environment and the overreach by some of the large regulatory agencies. And I know Pete and Colin can talk to you about some of the things that we've got facing us right now with the greenhouse gas, the fugitive emissions, especially on a gas well. Those increase the cost of a gas well dramatically. And you got to be in the business you've got to be able to make some money to be able to pay your employees. If it's not economic, you can't do it. I hope that helps. Yes, sir.
Okay, great, Pete,
Thank you, Tom.
continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Okay, so with that in mind, speaking of regulatory, this here is just a map of obviously Wyoming and the leases that are leases in Wyoming. So quite a lot, as you can tell. So the blue are leases held by production, and the purple are leases that do not yet have production. I should point out that this map is about 2 years old, but if I made the changes to it, it wouldn't be discernible by the eye at this point because there just hasn't been a lot of activity in leasing for obvious reasons. Up in the northwest, the top right hand of the map, of course, that is the Powder River Basin. That's where essentially most of the oil is found. This is all sort of rule of thumb. In the I meant northeast. In the southwest and in Sublet, that's mostly gas down there. I want to point out as we talk about EOR and all of that, up in the Bighorn Basin, up there in the Oregon Basin, it's just a really fascinating technological efforts up there. That basin has been in continuous production for about 100 years, and yet we estimate that we've only really accessed maybe about 30% of what's available up there. So it produces a lot of water and all this sort of thing. So the ability for us to continue to innovate with and develop new technologies to access our resources are so important. So I put this up here just to talk a little bit about what Mr. Van Cleef was mentioning about the BLM. You all know that about 50% of the surface is owned by the federal government, but about 2/3 of Wyoming's subsurface is owned by the federal government. So it's about I think it's somewhere I didn't write it down. I think it's somewhere in the order of 74% of Wyoming's oil and gas resources are federally owned or have some sort of federal nexus to it. So we're very highly dependent on what they do, and it has enormous knock-on effects with respect to land access, environmental reviews, stipulations, development techniques, timing, taxation, all of that. So let me talk for a minute about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act and what that did, and then we'll move on. The Inflation Reduction Act increased the federal royalty rate to 16.67%, up from 12.5%. And a lot of the justification for needing to do that was trying to compare it to state and private royalty rates. Of course, on state and private lands and minerals, it generally doesn't take 5 to 7 to 9 years to get approval in order to do projects. So we, in the oil industry, of course, we need an active and a professional and an efficient regulatory agencies that can get work done for us, and royalty rates that are commensurate with that are reasonable. In this case, paying for that kind of delay is frustrating. It also imposes an expression of interest fee, which is simply companies can say to the BLM, this is an area we think has a resource. We are interested in exploring it. Will you please put it out for lease? That for the first time now has a fee to just do that. It increases the minimum bid, and it increases the annual rentals to hold on to those leases year after year. And in Wyoming's case, what was troubling is it eliminates the so-called non-competitive bidding process. That really didn't matter to anyone but Wyoming, in part because Wyoming, particularly the Powder River Basin, is still an exploratory field. Places like the Bakken, fully explored. It's entirely it's in a development stage. They're just developing what they know is there, and they're not exploring for new. Wyoming is very exploratory. The fringes of the Powder River Basin, the northern DJ, these are exploratory areas. And what non-competitive lease sales did was allow entrepreneurs, risk takers like Mr. Van Cleef to get a lease on an area that maybe others thought you're crazy for thinking that there's a resource there. And then you know who was crazy for thinking that there was an accessible resource? The folks who developed the Jonah Field and became the largest field in the United States. So all told, those have been trouble, and I will talk a little about litigation later. And but I think really the direction of the Department of Interior is more a little bit more under the radar. Only nerds like Mr. McKee follow it on our behalf. They just recently issued 7 instruction memorandums to interpret the Inflation Reduction Act out of the Department of Interior that make leasing even harder in a number of ways. I'd love to give you examples. I can if we have more time, but I want to move on here. Because you guys can't really do much. So this,
Pete,
yeah.
I'll just interrupt you. So committee, if you want to pursue any of these issues further, just when we're done here or when you have time, get with Colin, with Pete. Tom's busy running a company, so
Yeah.
they hang around and they can give you more detail if you really want.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to that point, this slide was not meant to be read. It was merely to let you know that all of the active issues currently happening in PIW world and the oil and gas world from the Bureau of Land Management. Mr. McKee follows all of this. PIW pays attention, comments on, works with the BLM as much as we can on all of these things. So any of these that you see, we can certainly talk to you about. Same with the EPA. There's an entirely different list here regarding emissions, methane emissions, water quality, air quality, ozone, et cetera, that we are following very closely, and we'll be happy to talk to you about, or if your constituents have any sort of question about it, particularly as it relates to water quality in Wyoming. I think that tends to engender interest from your constituents, and we are happy to talk about that and efforts to ensure that our water remains clean for us and our future. Okay, a very, very brief tutorial moving into issues that you all control and will have authority over. I'm gonna give you just a very brief tutorial about how, once there's a lease in place and permits are in place, how it is that a company gets drills and gets access to drill and works with the landowner and all of that. So this again is a very simple example. This is a 2-section in somewhere in Wyoming. We'll say it's in the Powder River Basin. In fact, we will say that because I'm going to show you a split estate problem here in a second. Incidentally, these are the most common right now, these 2-mile laterals that you can drill for 2 miles under the surface. However, we are quickly moving to 3-mile laterals. So there'll probably be some regulatory and perhaps statutory issues we'll have to deal with as it relates to 3-mile laterals.
Pete?
Yes.
Just if you would give the members of the committee just an idea of what a lateral is.
Yep.
Please.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
And some of the people in the audience.
No,
Thanks.
you're absolutely right. Thank you for that, stop, Mr. Chairman. A lateral is a horizontal well. So most of the time, and in fact, this is why you can see our production today on 21 rigs matches and exceeds the kind of production we used to get when you'd say, well, our record rigs was this many rigs back in 1980, whatever. We own 21 rigs now, and we exceed production from those there. So these are the ones that go down to whatever formation, mile underground or more, and then they turn and they go horizontally, now up to 3 miles. And it's really a marvel of technology. It would be amazing if these reservoirs were flat like this, and you just turn and go. The reservoirs move, and so the drills move and follow that reservoir. And then after that is drilled, then of course the fracking crew comes in, perforates that well, and allows for the resource to flow from there. Generally, not generally, across the board, in terms of land impact, the reduction in land impact as a result of these of multiple well pads, drilling rigs, and then these horizontal wells, you can have companies that will go along a section line, drill, say, north and south, 2 miles or 3 miles, and move down that. So you're drilling an enormous amount of area with a very minimal land impact. And that's really an amazing development in technology for the oil and gas industry.
Pete, I don't want to rush you, but we're almost at 8 o'clock and I know you want to give Tom a chance to talk. So
Yep.
Just a reminder of the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. So let me just spend 1 minute on this, and then I think I'll skip over some of the rest of it and give it over to Tom. This is that same slide from above, but I've just put on there who perhaps owns the surface. And really, this is just to talk about 2 years ago, we went through a major change in Wyoming about how we deal with how companies get permits to drill, and then how we deal with mineral owners and landowners how we can work with them to make sure that they are paid for the resource that they own, how they can be compensated for damages and disruptions to their surface, particularly when we're in a split estate situation. So split estate, Mr. Chairman, is when the subsurface is owned by somebody other than who owns the surface. In Wyoming, that tends to be a private surface owner, and the federal government owns the minerals. The subsurface is the primary estate, and so the accessing the subsurface takes precedent, but there are steps in place to ensure that there is negotiations between the operator and the landowner for damages. And then I think the thing to keep in mind, and we can get into the details later about mineral owners. Generally, mineral owners lease with a company their minerals, and in order to allow for the development so that the mineral owner isn't on the hook for the expenses of drilling. That's what a working interest is called. It is a working interest pays for the expenses and enjoys the revenue. We get individual mineral owners out of that by leasing, but we set up a structure in 2020 that allows for unleased mineral owners, for whatever reason, to ensure via statute that they are paid a royalty even if they have not leased to a company. That issue will probably continue to come back to you, if not this session, this year. It's a complicated issue, and we can talk more about that. On the fee-fed, or on the split estate, This is just, I've just turned that map on its side. And so this is a situation where the private surface owned by private and their minerals are underneath them are owned by the same person. And then the horizontal well drills into federal subsurface. This is an unresolved question at the federal government. Under the Trump administration, they issued a policy that said that the federal government does not have the authority to regulate the surface of the private surface in this case, even though it accesses federal minerals. They can regulate the downhole, but not the surface. There's litigation now that is trying to say that the BLM would in fact have authority to regulate activity on private surface in the case of horizontal wells accessing federal minerals. That's a very critical issue for this state and for our industry and for private landowners in Wyoming, not ag landowners essentially in the state that is currently unresolved. Mr. Chairman, there's so much to talk about, and I appreciate you letting me do this. We all know the carbon capture is a necessity, and it's one of many of my companies are actively pursuing. I just want to point out on this, we're going to have some carbon capture, perhaps a bill or two this session that we'll look at. I think we'll probably ask that we take some time and talk a little bit more. We actually have a system in place right now with respect to who owns the pore space and how that works. We're way out ahead of the curve on that in Wyoming, but there are some things that probably need to be done there. I put this up here just to point out that currently, globally, full quarter of carbon capture and storage happens here in Wyoming at the Chute Creek LaBarge facility in Southwest Wyoming that's operated by Exxon. We've been doing it since 1986, and amazingly, we capture 25% of the global carbon currently. Last thing I'm going to spend a minute on here and then turn it over to Mr. Van Cleef is just our tax structure. It's a little bit busy, but it essentially compares us with other states. This chart was put together by the equivalent of LSO in Colorado about the tax rates in the effective tax rates in these states, and you can see that Wyoming is the most expensive. It's a little bit dated, but I have not yet found an updated comparison like this. And you'll have a lot of conversations about this session because at this point, I think there's approximately 78 property tax bills that have been filed. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in part because you've been hearing about it from your constituents. And so we'll talk about that. But to that point, when it comes to this is data from the Wyoming Taxpayers Association. I know many of you met Ms. Harpstreet earlier. In terms of property tax, minerals in Wyoming pays for over half of the property tax in Wyoming, and that is in large part because minerals are valued at 100% of their value, and then mill levies applied to that, industrial at 11.5% and residential at 9.5%. So we have, just to put a finer point on it, the Pinedale Anticline over 15 years generated enough property tax to pay for around 25,000 students, Wyoming students, to go through K through 12. The average home in Wyoming, the average property tax on that home, double it, pay that for 15 years, and that will cover one student to go through K through 3. So there's quite a bit of disparity and quite a bit of gap in that in Wyoming's tax code, and it is a problem for Wyoming that we will discuss more. Quick slide on where that money goes. I will leave that for you to look at, and then I will, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, turn it to Tom for a couple of minutes.
Tom, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Previously introduced myself. My name is Tom Van Cleef. I am 50% of a small mom and pop, Oil Mountain Energy. And we are not unusual. If you run the stats, and we ran the stats on this based on Oil and Gas Commission numbers about a year and a half ago, what you'll find is that 85% of Wyoming's oil and gas industry is made up of small mom and pops. They're small operators that have fewer than 15 wells that make less than 10 barrels of oil a day. Okay? Now, that sounds like a lot. That's 350 small businesses. Of those 350 small businesses that directly support about 10 other small local businesses, okay, and just in our industry, those 85% of the industry contribute about 49% of the production that Wyoming has. So based on Pete's slides, small operators pay about 25% of the state's revenues. These are small operators like myself, like my neighbors, like your neighbors, that are out there every day. And I do apologize. I had to wear my steel toes because as soon as I leave here, gonna have a quick breakfast with Pete, and then I got to get back up because we got a well down. And my wife, who's 59, and I will be throwing 36-inch wrenches at about 3 o'clock this afternoon because that's what we do. Some of our colleagues have wells that are producing 4 gallons of oil a week, and they keep those wells in operation. Pete talked about wells, and we've talked about the wells that move down the food chain from the large operators. That's what the small operators in Wyoming do. We take the wells that won't work for enhanced oil recovery, and they would be subject to being plugged and abandoned, and the state would lose that revenue. We would lose the revenue for the schools. We would lose the revenues to support roadworks, to support the public works. And small operators are the ones who take those and keep them in operation and make them economic, because my economics are a lot different than my other colleagues. And I am on the board of the Petroleum Association, and I am at the small end of the gene pool on the board. I can take some of their wells and keep them in operation, which is a benefit for the state, and it's a benefit for our nation, because that allows us to continue to produce the energy that America needs. Whether or not we transition to a green future or not, we are always going to need petroleum products. My wells pump asphalt. We put it on the ground. If we go to 100% Priuses, you're going to need asphalt for the Priuses to drive on. So that's why the oil and gas industry, no matter where you think we're going, that's why the oil and gas industry remains critical. And I just wanted to emphasize that the bulk of the oil and gas industry in Wyoming is Wyoming based. There are folks like me. My capital, we talked about capital, Representative Western, my capital doesn't go anywhere else. My capital stays here. All of my investment capital goes into 8 tiny little wells on Oil Mountain that Kit Carson started back in the 1800s, because that's who the first operator on Oil Mountain was. All of our capital stays here. All of our investments stay here. We are Wyoming. We are, the oil and gas industry is Wyoming. It's Wyoming oil. It's not big oil. Now, the Petroleum Association, I don't have regulatory affairs people. I don't have legislative liaisons. I don't have lobbyists. As the chairman indicated, I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has, because this is important for the state and for y'all. But at the end of the day, I got to go back and run a company. I got to turn wrenches. I have to rely on the Petroleum Association to help myself and the 85% of the industry that are folks just like me. Okay? My legislative liaison is Pete Obermuller. My regulatory affairs guy is Colin. And they help us out by keeping us informed of things that would come back and bite us, would cause when a pickup truck comes down the road with a white license plate and a regulatory guy hops out and says, oh, by the way, you're no longer in compliance because here's the new rule that we publish without letting anybody know. The Petroleum Association keeps us informed. They help us stay in compliance. They help us work with our state regulatory agencies. And ladies and gentlemen, I would much rather have a Wyoming regulator come out and work with me than someone with federal credentials. So when the Petroleum Association comes and speaks with you, they're going to speak about a lot of big issues, a lot of big ticket issues, a lot of issues that on the surface would not affect small operators like us. Because while I mentioned my wife is one of the best petroleum engineers I know, and one of the best engineers I've worked with in 40 years, and I've done some interesting work in 40 years. While she would love to drill, we don't have the money to drill. So what we do is we make what we have better and cleaner, and we do it with the help of the Petroleum Association. And the Petroleum Association is here to help the state and to help each one of you help us as your voters, as your neighbors, and as the citizens of Wyoming. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And so committee, I don't want to go too far into the 8 o'clock hour. I appreciate coming, and I'll give a plug for the Petroleum Association's website. If you want to get into details on some of this and other things, just go to the website. They used to publish a book, which was a great book on regulatory issues that they deal with. I think that's what, Pete, am I correct? That's on the website. So, okay, and for full disclosure, I am a member of the PAW. I've been a member for, I don't know how long. I used to be on the board, and that. So I just wanted people to understand that. That's, like I said, it's just for full disclosure. And we're gonna have other groups in too, to do this same thing. And we're gonna take a short break, and I mean very short, before we get the meeting kicked off. So whoever's interested in open banking and off-road vehicle operation, come back in pretty quick. So, and for the other legislators who were here, I hope this was helpful to all of you. And I don't think you got the handouts. Pete, do you have any extra handouts left?
I don't.
Okay, I will make mine available to them. They can copy them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for this
A
time.
quick thank you very much, Pete, Colin, Tom. Go drill, Tom. Go. So the break will last as long as it takes for me to take a break and get back in the room. So don't dally. Okay, room will come to order. The room will come to order. Thank you. So we'll get ready to start the committee meeting. I do have a few announcements and housekeeping. As I said at our last meeting, it is my preference to not permit remote testimony at these meetings. If it's important enough, I think you should be here in person, other than for some extenuating circumstances. At the request of management and due to some extenuating circumstances, I believe we have 2 county commissioners from the western part of the state will speak by Zoom. I understand the roads over there are pretty bad. So even with that, I ask that those people who attend remotely honor the decorum of the meeting, and that this is a meeting of the legislature and courtesy and respect is required. So keep the discussion open, follow the rules of decorum. We don't attack people, we discuss the bills. For the committee and for people at the front desk, please turn your mics off when you're not speaking, and that helps with the feedback. And remember to adjust the chair and through the chair. And again, keep it civil. And I will shut it down if people get out of line. Keep the side conversations down out of respect to the people who are speaking to us, whether in person or remotely. But generally on the remote attendance, it is my preference to not have that, other than, again, extreme circumstances. And with that, are there any questions about the rules? Good. There aren't any. So with that, we'll start. And Mark, if you would take roll, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Banks.
Here.
Representative Conrad.
Here.
Representative Heiner.
Here.
Representative Knapp.
Here.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Lawley. Representative Tarver. Representative Western. Chairman Burkhart.
Here. Thank you, Mark. So 100% attendance, great. So with that, the first bill for our consideration is House Bill 62, Open Banking. And we have our own Representative Western and Senator Rothfuss. Welcome to the House Minerals to present. And for the committee's understanding, if you have a bill up in committee, even if it's this committee, you'll probably be asked to sit there and present it. If I have one up, I will do the same, and Representative Heiner will fill in as chairman. And that's just the protocol we've used for years, and we'll continue to do that. So with that, Representative, Senator, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, so I know when you see open banking, you're looking at this and it's kind of wondering, what the heck's going on with this bill? Why is it in minerals? I want to give a little bit of context first. So the reason this is in minerals is because this originated out of the Select Committee on Blockchain and Financial Technology. And the way that statute was written when we passed was that any bills that Select Committee passes are allowed to go get passed out, sponsored on their own, with the exception of bills that come out of that task force that have to deal with financial regulation. Those have to come through minerals as just kind of an additional checkpoint for dialogue and scrutiny. So that's why you're seeing here today. So some of you are probably wondering, what is open banking? And to give it some context, about 5 years ago, the legislature, and I'm very proud, and Senator Rothfuss was instrumental in making this happen. We passed a lot of pretty awesome and innovative legislation regarding blockchain technology and digital assets, and specifically around banking operations. We issued the first, basically, crypto bank license, the first bank charter for banks that want to transact and do banking operations in digital assets and cryptocurrencies. And so that's kind of the template or the background information of what this is related to. And so what open banking is conceptually is, these types of banks, mainly, like I say, these crypto banks that are here in Wyoming. We've got a couple here in Cheyenne. It is a concept, it's kind of a misnomer, I guess, in terms of the open banking part. It's kind of just innovative banking, I guess you could call it. What it is that it allows these digital asset banks to work with these kind of third-party tech companies called APIs, these application program interface. Now, one of the questions you could easily ask is, well, what is that? How do they operate? Are they widely used today? And they're very widely used. For example, we all know about PayPal and Venmo, right? I don't know if each of you have it, but they do, billions in transactions every single day. Both those companies use an API, an application program interface, to transfer that money between customers. So for example, if you create a PayPal account and you need to link your PayPal account with your actual bank account, they use an API. For one of the biggest ones out there is called Plaid. They use Plaid to help basically connect the PayPal account with your bank account seamlessly without having to wait multiple days and do all that kind of stuff. It makes it just easier and more convenient. So that's an example of an API that millions of Americans currently use right now. And so the concept here is to allow these APIs to work with some of these banks to improve these banking functions that some of these banks perform for some of their customers. And so I'll be happy to walk through the bill with you guys. Obviously, page 1, we've got the enabling clause. Page 2, we've got our definitions. And to be really clear, this is not something that these crypto banks can just do. If they want to work with an API and use customer data, that customer has to explicitly consent to this action. As you can kind of see, it's right there, lines 6 through 10, with express written consent. Again, it only works if the customer is willing to consent to this. So there's no kind of assumption on behalf of these banks or these APIs. The customer has to know, and they have to explicitly consent. Obviously, lines 12 through 16 on page 2, open banking means providing access directly or indirectly to customer data from the customer's bank to a third-party financial service provider with the express written consent of the customer through the use of application programming interfaces. Like I said, those APIs. Right there, just a bank may participate and provide for open banking. Again, banks don't have to do this. We have lots of these small community banks throughout Wyoming that we all use. They can do this if they want or not. It's a totally optional thing. Then obviously on page 3, kind of goes through, the commissioner, if you see lines 9 through 12, the commissioner shall adopt rules regulating the collection, use, and disclosure of customer data and open banking consistent with all applicable state and federal laws and regulations. And then obviously on page 4, we've got the inaction date. So I don't know, Chris, did I cover, or Senator Rothfuss, did I cover most of that, or do you want to add anything?
Absolutely.
Senator Rothfuss, please.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to emphasize a couple of points in the way that we structured this out of the Blockchain Select Committee. The first is that it's a very forward-looking piece of legislation from the standpoint of Wyoming trying to be the first mover in open banking. It's important to realize that other countries are already using open banking and have laws in place and regulatory structures, the United Kingdom, South Korea. Really, you look around the globe and there are different examples of regulatory structures associated with open banking. What we have right now in the United States is no express forbiddance. Nobody's saying you can't open bank. Nobody's saying you can do open banking. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at the national level is looking into this, as they have been for over a decade, to figure out what, if any, rules we should have in place to protect consumers. Right now, there really aren't any. So whereas this bill draft is effectively targeting an action by our Division of Banking, saying, come up with rational rules to provide a regulatory structure to enable effective open banking in the state of Wyoming, to be a leader in that space. It's important to realize that it could potentially be done right now. However, if it were done right now, it wouldn't be with consumer protections in place. It wouldn't be with a regulatory structure in place. So when you look at recent news related to digital assets, where you had some concerns, probably if you read those news stories, you know that the reason for those concerns is based on the fact that there was effectively no oversight. There was no regulatory structure governing those actions, and bad things happened. Our philosophy on the Blockchain Select Committee over the past 5 years when we've been working on this legislation has been to regulate to enable. In other words, create an ecosystem where digital assets and financial technologies can thrive in the state of Wyoming because they have bright lines. They'll operate within those lines. And what you end up with then is good actors acting in a regulated space in our system, as opposed to bad actors doing what we've typically seen. We like to say that that circumstance that we read about with FTX wouldn't have happened in Wyoming, and it couldn't have happened in Wyoming because we put together a regulatory structure that provides oversight of assets, of lending, of utilization in a way that would not allow that. With open banking, we want to do the same thing. We want to be the leader in the country in open banking, the first jurisdiction that explicitly provides a regulatory structure to enable open banking in a positive way, allowing our banks access to that. And it's not just our digital asset banks. Any of our banks would have access to open banking with this statutory construct. But we do understand that the digital asset banks that we've been building through the special purpose depository institution legislation from 3 years ago is probably where a lot of this will formatively be used and created. So we're excited about that. The structure of this, though, as we worked on it on the select committee, we knew that there were going to be a lot of questions, first of all, and we knew that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at the federal level was drafting rules. We just don't know when they're actually going to come out. So there is a rule set that's been pretty well vetted through the CFPB, but they just don't pull the trigger on it. So that's a basis for drafting state rules. But if we're the first mover, we can do what we've done before, which is guide the discussion. We then become the agent of discussion that effectively puts the regulatory structure in the form that we'd like, Mr. Chairman. And that's an important part of first mover advantage, is having things go your way. So we start with a robust set of standards and regulations that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been drafting and use that as the baseline. You'll also see something which is a little bit different from traditional legislation, which is that the effective date of this legislation is not July 1st, 2023. It's July 1st, 2024. That's not a typo. That's intentional. And it recognizes that we want another legislative session to clean up any concerns we have. This is a very short bill, Mr. Chairman. It provides a lot of flexibility to the Division of Banking to put together best practices in a regulatory structure that goes into effect immediately. And then we want another cycle to come back to work through the interim, through the Blockchain Select Committee, to come to the legislature and to have a second iteration on this so that we correct any concerns we have and legislate an appropriate mechanism. We want to be ahead. We want to be a leader in open banking. This is a pathway to that leadership, which gives us economic diversification, builds our economy, gives us good jobs, and moves us into a space that we're looking towards, which is innovative financial technologies. So I hope you'll join me and my colleague in supporting this legislation, and again, trying to move Wyoming into the innovative technology space, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And for the rest of the committee, if you want to know anything about cryptocurrency, this type of banking, all of that sort of thing, Senator Rothfuss is kind of our in-house expert, along with Representative Western. They can answer all your questions, explain it to you in the details that you might need. So, thank you. Any questions for either? Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Representative Western, Senator Rothfuss, for you filled in some gaps. I just had one thing I wanted to clarify in my own mind, is on page 3, line 6, when it talks about obtaining the customer's express written consent. Are you envisioning something like we do now digitally, a kind of a have to accept as you kind of digitally pass through a screen and maybe read, maybe don't read, and then give a consent that way? That's what you're visualizing?
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Lawley, if you go back to page 2 and look at lines 6 through 10, we provide a definition for express written consent for that reason. And this is an area where it's important that we have some consumer protections in place, because right now you could imagine a the traditional end user license agreement, click here, there's no way you're going to read it, there's no way you're going to scroll through, you don't know what you're signing off on. I remember in the early days of the internet, there was one where you click through it, the end user license agreement, and you've transmitted your soul to the company that was doing it, right? There's always been some good things because nobody's going to read those. We have that concern, and we worked on some good legislation over the last few years that related to genetic privacy, genetic information privacy. And so we took some of the concepts about express written consent from that, implemented in this so that we have a customer's affirmative written response to be a clear and conspicuous notice regarding the collection, use, or disclosure of customer data for the purposes of open banking. So we want more than just the "I didn't read it" click if you're going to engage this way. And that will again be something that we can come back and iterate through, but this is what we'd like to see the Division of Banking spend some time focusing on, that level of consent. Now, what I'll note right now is, again, you could probably do this right now, and you could do it with the simple end user license agreement, I click here, because nothing is governing it. If you were to put together an API in open banking right now, you don't have those assurances in place. So that's a critical part of this. And you can see it really is the only thing that we focused on to be explicit from the rules standpoint, is we wanted to set a very high bar of written consent, and obviously you'd have opt-in, opt-out capacity and a lot of the other concepts. Thank you, Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Conrad?
Chairman Brookhart, thank you, and Representative Western and Senator Rothfuss, thank you as well. As we refer to, or more importantly, look at the overall, the origin on 13.1.101, just a quick question for, or more importantly, I guess a clarifying question. 13.1.101 states that a bank, let me quote, "Bank means any corporation excluding a national bank having a place of business within the state which engages in the business, or rather banking business." My clarifying question is this: what about those banks who are out of state but are currently doing business within or for residents of the state of Wyoming? Say, for example, a credit union in Utah. Is that still applicable in this regards?
Representative Western, you look like you want to answer that one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely, they can still take advantage of some of these types of technologies. Like I said, they can do it right now. And kind of going back to what Senator Rothfuss said is that's why one of the big components of this bill is having those definitions, that if you're going to engage in this type of practice, that there has to be clear and written consent.
Mr. Chairman, quick follow-up on that.
Senator Rothfuss, please.
Thank you. I will note, though, that as we develop this, it will only be for state chartered banks that our statutes are going to bind. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau work will probably have to come to fruition before national banks, nationally chartered banks operating in the state of Wyoming would be bound by it. So it's honestly one of the ways, for example, with our Speedy banks, special purpose depository institution banks, those have to be state chartered banks. That's what we want. We want our state chartered banks, which are capable of operating freely in any other jurisdiction in the country. So that's something that I don't know if all committee members know yet. We're the banking committee, whether you know it or not. We're the banking committee. So you'll hear all of this a million times. State chartered banks have the authority to operate in any state. So one of our philosophies as we were building this new type of state chartered bank was to enable a bank that then could be effectively domiciled in the state of Wyoming, have its core operations in the state of Wyoming, which we would require, but then operate in 50 states with financial instruments that couldn't be used elsewhere. And so we are trying to basically give an advantage to our Wyoming state chartered banks such that they would want to domicile here, use open banking, and then operate in the rest of the states under this regulatory structure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions? Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Western, I believe you mentioned that the Consumer Protection Bureau has been working on similar rules for the past 10 years, but you're only giving our Banking Commission 18 months to come up with rules. Is that going to be possible?
Representative Western.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, in our discussion throughout the interim, the Banking Commission indicated that would probably be enough time. In the event that they, I don't want to speak for them, if they need more, be more than willing to amend it so they can have all the time that they need. Because I think certainly with this first iteration of rules that these agencies come up with, we want to make sure they have all the time they need to get it right. Certainly, we'll be coming back at some point in the future and making updates to this kind of stuff. But in the interim discussion, we would like to believe that that would be adequate. In the event that things have changed, I'm more than happy to tack on more time.
And Mr. Chairman,
Senator.
again, just to follow on that, I'll reiterate that is the reason why we've got that delayed effective date, so that we've got another legislative session. If they come back and say, wow, we were wrong, we need more time, we can delay it further.
Other questions? Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had another question as it pertains to express written consent. Do you think that banks will interpret this as, I go down to the bank and print my name on a blank line and then sign it at the end of a page? Or will they try to do that digitally and say, type your name in and this is your digital signature agreeing to these terms?
Senator or
Mr. Chairman,
representative either?
Yeah, so we are compliant with UEFA, which is the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act. Anyway, it basically creates an equivalency for certain standards of engagement of electronics. So when we say something like this, the state of Wyoming, through the Corporations Committee about 8 years ago, proactively made it clear statutorily that language like that would include an authoritative digital signature or other electronic transactions, so long as it's recognized to legitimate standards and protocols. So it can't just be the point and click equivalent, but yes, we have authoritatively in Wyoming statute that a digital signature, electronic signature, is the equivalent legally of a written transaction.
Okay. Other questions? Other questions? Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. If you'd hang with us, Senator, Representative, and for the committee, I'll tell you something. If appearing before your own home committee can be a little daunting. It's actually worse than being on the floor, I think. So I think with that, and we've had some questions, I'd call on the Division of Banking to come on up first before we start really opening this up. And the usual name and position for the record, and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jeremiah Bishop. I'm the Banking Commissioner and head of the Wyoming Division of Banking. First, I'll just give a little bit of background to what we do. As Senator Rother said, all of our bills generally go through this committee, and I know there's a lot of new members on this committee. I'll just very briefly go through. So we regulate state chartered banks and other financial institutions through Title 13. So that's Title 13 is banks and trust companies. We do other institutions as well, but those sometimes come through such as mortgage lenders, consumer lenders, money transmitters. Right now, we have 23 state chartered banks that we regulate. Again, these are only banks chartered in the state of Wyoming. We do not regulate national banks. We don't regulate banks that may be state chartered in another state but have branches in Wyoming. It may be a bank out of Colorado, Montana, California, but they have a branch here. We don't regulate those banks generally. We also do not regulate credit unions. So that's something to just maybe to be aware of. So we do safety and soundness examinations of these institutions. We also create rules on banking activity in Wyoming when directed by a statute such as this one. So that's just a very brief overview of what we do. So there's several areas I'm going to cover as regards to open banking in this bill. One is just the scope of potential rulemaking, topics that might be included in our rules, possible subsequent scope of later rulemaking if needed. And then also a few comments on the relationship with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau rulemaking and what they've been working on. I'll go through this quickly, but obviously if there's questions, let me interrupt as needed. So the first item is the initial scope of potential rulemaking. So at a high level, this bill seeks to enhance customer protection because it requires a Wyoming state bank to give customers a notice and receive their consent before the bank provides customer data to a third-party financial service provider. An example would be a consumer wants to use a budget app, and they want that budget app to get information from their bank account. And so that would require them to give written consent to the bank to share their maybe account balances and transaction information with that budget app. So that's just one example of how this could be used. As was stated before today, without this bill, banks can engage in open banking, but without the notice and consent structure. And so this bill, it has two sources of rulemaking authority for me and my office. First is it just to adopt rules and regulations on the collection and use and disclosure of customer data in open banking, as long as it's consistent with applicable state and federal law, and then also just any other rulemaking necessary to implement the act. So for initial rulemaking, we seek to provide a little more detail on the notice that must be given to customers prior to the bank providing access of that data. So we might provide a little bit more rules on when is that notice clear and conspicuous, areas or topics to be addressed in the notice in order to adequately cover the collection, use, or disclosure of customer data. And I'll go through a list of potential items that may be included in rulemaking here in a little bit. But since this bill definitely, the clear intent is to have that notice and written consent structure, that's where we would focus most of our rulemaking, is maybe providing more background on what that written consent is. This is something that we have a written consent order in other areas of our rules and laws, so it is something that we are familiar with. And so we'd probably use similar language in this one as well. So some of the areas that we could use, we haven't reached any conclusions on what we will fully include in rulemaking if this bill passes, but I do want to just go through a few areas that we are considering to include in rulemaking. The first is the data access scope, about whether third parties with authorized access to customer data from the bank can access only the data necessary to provide the product or services selected by the consumer, or are those third parties allowed to access additional data not included in that express written consent? The next item is data retention, and that is about whether third parties with authorized access to data maintain consumer data only as long as necessary to provide the service, or can they hold on to that information for a longer period of time? The next item is data access transparency. That's about whether and how consumers can request information from the bank on what customer data of theirs is being shared and who is it being shared with. Another item is limits on data use, and that is about whether the bank will prohibit or limit third parties from secondary or other uses of the customer data. In other words, should this third party use the customer data only for the product or service provided to the customer, or can that third party use that data for other purposes? Another item is revoking consent, and that is about whether and how a customer can revoke their consent for the bank to share their data. Next item, expiration of consent, is about whether and when a customer's or consumer's consent to open banking expires and needs to be renewed, or if the consent is permanent until revoked. That's something that we could clear out in rulemaking. Another item, data accuracy, is about whether and how a consumer can dispute and resolve inaccurate data that was shared through open banking. And then finally, data security. Obviously, that's a very important one, and that's just about the bank protecting against security breaches, including its due diligence into third-party vendors for data security. So these are potential issues that may be important that could be fleshed out in the rulemaking process. The next one is maybe kind of subsequent scope of potential later rulemaking. So it sounds like this is kind of a work in progress. Obviously, we have until July of next year to do this, which could also make the law itself potentially change. And so with that, we may not do everything up front, but we can later on come back. And some of the items that we could do is rulemaking and customer agreements that govern the collection, use, or disclosure. So we can do the written consent, but also the written agreement with that bank or with a third party. A lot of the topics I just covered could be included in either the consent or in the agreement. We could work that out. A third potential area is requirements on banks in managing their third-party relationships. So obviously, open banking occurs in the context of the bank's third-party relationship and sharing customer information with that third party. Right now, we wouldn't include this in our initial rulemaking just because banks currently have third-party due diligence requirements that they're held to. But this is something we could maybe flesh out specifically to open banking at a later time if needed. The final topic is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau rulemaking relationship to this bill. That's the CFPB is how it's generally referred to. So they've been required since 2010 to issue rules on consumer access to financial records. While the concept of open banking may not have existed in 2010, the CFPB rulemaking would address items that are related to open banking as it's defined today, and given it involves consumer providing third-party businesses with access to their records. So just a little bit of a background and short history of what the CFPB's actions have been. Right now, they have not issued any proposed or final rules on this area. A little bit of a history. In 2017, they issued a consumer protection principle, consumer authorized financial data sharing and aggregation. In 2020, they sought public comment related to open banking to help them inform proposed rules, but the CFPB has not issued proposed rules at this time. In October of just last year, the CFPB released a 70-page outline of proposals and alternatives under consideration for the rulemaking, and they set a deadline of January of 2023 to receive comments. So the October 22 proposal is similar to this bill because it includes at a high level a concept where the consumer receives an authorized disclosure and must provide consent to the terms of the disclosure before it is shared. I'd say I note a big difference is between this bill and what the CFPB has put out so far is that the CFPB proposal requires the third party, not the bank, to provide the disclosure and receive the consent. The October of 2022 proposal is also different from this bill because the CFPB says it would require firms to make a consumer's financial information available to a third party at that consumer's direction. But this bill does not require that banks make a consumer's financial data available to third parties. It simply says if the bank does so, it needs to provide notice and get consent beforehand. The October proposal also covers topics related to the data access scope, retention, limits on data use, data security, revoking consent, and data accuracy that I went through earlier. So our rulemaking under this, as it's stated in the bill, must be consistent with applicable state and federal laws. And so if we completed all the work on rulemaking before the CFPB, and then the CFPB issues their final rules at a later date, we would most likely have to go back and amend our rules just so that it's consistent with those federal rules. That's all the comments I'd have at this moment, but I'd open for any questions.
Any questions for Commissioner Bishop? And I think from the commissioner's testimony, you get an idea of the extent of what our banking division does. It's kind of, besides that, it's some education for the committee, I think. And thank you very much. Okay, no questions? All right. With that, then, let's see. I'll open it for public comment. Any legislators in the room wish to speak? Anybody from the governor's office? Any other agencies? Okay. Anyone else in the room? Okay, come on down, Scott.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Scott Meyer, and I am with the Wyoming Bankers Association. We have a few comments that we'd like to throw out regarding this open banking comment.
Please
bill.
proceed.
We represent all of Wyoming's community banks. And under this current bill, where it talks about providing access directly or indirectly to the consumer data of the customer's bank to a third-party financial provider with the express written consent of the customer and through the use of application programming interfaces. That's a lot of language in there, but I think that both Representative Western and Senator Rothfuss explained it, as did the commissioner, that can cover a lot of different things, and it was intended to make sure that they cover a lot of those. As previously mentioned, they do have a lot of this stuff already in place. People are doing it. We already have open banking, if you will consider vendors that are aggregators, like Intuit or Plaid or LifeLock, where you can have these interfaces. Most of the fintech firms, however, don't like this because they have to pay those aggregators for that information, and they would rather deal directly with the financial institution. So that's where you come up with these third-party payment providers. I think Senator Roth has brought it up with these APIs, these application programming interfaces where they can deal with your bank, but there are other ones as well. There are account information service providers where if somebody wants to have their financial situation handled by like a financial planner or whatever, those people can gather all the information. They may not be doing interfaces like that. They just want to have the information so they can help their customers and their clients deal with their financial matters. And then there are payment initiative service providers that can actually start making payments for you from your accounts. So a lot of this stuff comes up to the fact that while the community banks understand and their customers want to have this, at least some of them want to have this ability, understand that there's a high level of risk. And it's the risks that we are always keeping an eye on and making sure of because we are held to such a high standard of safety and soundness for Wyoming banks. I think it was brought up that, the CFPB, and I think our only real concern at this point in time is that, yes, since 2010, there was some talk about this, but really, interestingly enough, on October 27th, when we had the Minerals Committee meeting and there was discussion about, well, the feds aren't doing it, so we need to get involved. That same day, the CFPB came out with their directive and saying that they were going to take comments through January this year, and they should have something out by 2024, which is kind of where ours is. So our only real concern when we look at that stuff is, one, how does that cover? As was previously mentioned, our banking commission and the Wyoming laws only affect Wyoming chartered banks. They have no impact on nationally chartered banks or federally chartered credit unions. So to what extent does that apply where the CFPB is actually looking at for all financial institutions? The other question that comes up is that while we fully support the consumer's ability to access their information, we believe that it needs to be looked at very carefully, and it does need to be looked at from a lot of input from both community banks, but from also all other financial institutions like credit unions. With that being said, and I think that the commissioner just made a comment about it, as the statute reads right now, it says that they have to comply with all applicable state and federal law. So if the CFPB is going to come out with something, they have to follow it. If we turn around and do a bunch of rulemaking, are we going to have to go back and change it? Or do we work really with them? I'm not sure that anybody really works with the CFPB. With all due respect to Senator Rothfuss, we like to be the leaders on this stuff, but I'm not sure they listen. So however we want to do that, that was my only thought and concern, is that I'm not sure if we're working together, if it's a wise use of our time and resources, and having our division of banking spend time generating rules and having public hearings on them if we got something coming back from the CFPB.
Thank you,
Other than
Mr.
that,
Mayor.
stand for any questions.
Any questions? Any questions for the Banking Association? No? So one thing I would say is over time, probably sit down and have a good discussion with your local banker, especially the small community ones that are so vital to our towns. So thank you, Mr. Mayor. Okay. We have zoomed in, and again, you all know my feelings, but I will allow it. Mike, I believe, Carone with the Consumer Data Industry Association. Mr. Carone, are you on? And did I pronounce your name correctly?
Good afternoon. Yes, you did pronounce my name correctly, Chairman. Usually most folks get that wrong, but I appreciate that. I understand your willingness, and I appreciate you allowing me to testify virtually. Unfortunately, I was not able to make a visit out there. I found out late afternoon yesterday, and it's difficult to travel that far away on short notice, but I appreciate the opportunity to testify virtually today. So with that being said, good morning. Good morning, Chairman Burkhart Jr. and House members of the Minerals Business and Economic Development Committee. I'm Mike Carone with the Consumer Data Industry Association. We'd like to offer comments on House Bill 62. Quick introduction on CDIA. We are the voice of the consumer reporting industry. We were founded in 1906. We represent consumer reporting agencies, including the nationwide credit bureaus, regional and specialized credit bureaus, background check, and residential screening companies, amongst other companies as well. As I think we all know, House Bill 62 would define open banking as providing access to consumer data from the customer's bank to a third-party financial services provider with the express written consent of the customer and using application program interfaces. Participating banks would be required to comply with all applicable state and federal regulations. The bill would also allow the State Banking Commission to adopt rules regulating the collection, use, and disclosure of customer data in open banking. I don't want to bore you with some of the other details that may have been mentioned already on here, but I'd like to point out that under Section 1033 of the Federal Dodd-Frank Act, the law requires the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, as we know, to prescribe rules to provide consumers access rights to their financial records. The attendance requirement, commonly referred to as open banking, would allow consumers to easily share their financial data with third parties. As we know, the CFPB is currently in the rulemaking process. In November, they released a proposal that is still under consideration for a small business review session that is supposed to take place this year, and this is necessary to draft their proposed rules. Back in October at a fintech conference in Las Vegas, the CFP director, Rohit Chopra, noted that the agency expects to propose requiring financial institutions that offer transaction accounts to set up secure methods for data sharing and will develop requirements to limit the misuse and abuse of personal financial data. The director, Chopra, noted a goal to formally propose a rule in 2023 and finalize that in 2024. So given the broad oversight of financial entities under the CFPB's jurisdiction and expected federal action, separate rulemaking in Wyoming could be conflicting and possibly establish required policies that are inconsistent with the federal requirements. Further, as drafted, we're concerned the requirements in this proposed legislation will place barriers to consumers sharing their financial information, which is the goal of all of this. The draft requirements state that a financial institution obtain the consumer's express written consent along with required API interface. This could establish multiple consent obligations for a consumer and make matters confusing. A quick example is a consumer using open banking could establish consent by entering their credentials through an API. With a separate written consent standard, the financial institution may need to maintain separate consent from the API process, placing barriers to that very consumer accessing and sharing their financial records. It would also place unnecessary obligations on state banks that offer other financial institutions would not have. If the legislation would move forward, the committee should consider amending in this provision, we respectfully believe. So with the regulatory uncertainty at the CFPB while they're establishing this rulemaking and the risk of conflicting requirements on consumers and financial institutions, we encourage the state of Wyoming to monitor the open banking environment. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And I appreciate your time to allow me to speak today.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Carone? Any questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. excuse me, Mr. Carone, very much.
Thank you. You aced my name. Usually folks don't get it right the first time.
Yeah, thank you. So any other public comment? With that, I'll close public comment. Committee? Moved by Larson.
Second.
Seconded by Conrad. Discussion? Okay. Go through the bill, page 1. Page 2. Page 3. Page 4. Question being called. We're voting on House Bill 62, open banking. Mr. Knotts, would you please call roll?
Representative Banks,
Aye.
Representative Conrad,
Aye.
Representative Heiner,
Aye.
Representative Knapp,
Aye.
Representative Larson,
Aye.
Representative Lawley,
Aye.
Representative Tarver,
Aye.
Representative Western, Chairman Burkhart.
Aye.
There are 9 ayes, 0 noes. This is a due pass.
Okay, thank you. House Bill 62, open banking, passes the Minerals Business and Economic Development Committee. Thank you. Thank you, Senator. We'll see you again, I know. Of course. Yes, okay. The next bill for our consideration is House Bill 62, off-road recreational vehicle operation. And who will present this bill? Director Reiner, I guess you volunteered. Deputy Director Glenz, I guess you volunteered also. Mr. Rossetti? Oh, you brought the whole crew. Uh-oh, Mr. Gillette is also coming down. So House Bill 42, off-road recreational vehicle operation. Take it away, whichever one of you wants to volunteer. Don't argue.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, good morning. Luke Reiner is the name, Director of YDOT. I certainly have a team here. I'll let them introduce themselves as they speak up. It is our pleasure this morning to talk to you about a House bill pertaining to ORVs. Let me just paint the picture, and I'll kick it over to Deputy Director Glenn and to Mr. Rossetti and the rest of the crew to talk some details. But certainly, from the YDOT perspective, our purpose in life is to support our state's economy, to connect our communities, and to make lives better for the residents of the state. That's my charge. And this concept of ORVs directly ties to all 3 of those goals in our purpose statement. So we are in support of state parks. We are in support of the Southwest off-road trails. We are in support of the economic development of the state. And we have worked to get to yes in this space on this request. We've been really at this for about 2 years in terms of working to integrate off-road vehicles into our transportation system. And I respect the leaders in this space as they work to expand their economy a lot. There have certainly been challenges as we work through here and lots of ripple effects. So let me just in terms of really what we've worked through here from a YDOT perspective, I'll talk about, and then we'll kick it over. So first, the request has been, in support of the state parks is connecting their trail system. And we'll let Mr. Glenn talk about the trail system. And the concept there that really brought this to light was using a short 3.5 mile piece of interstate to connect 2 trails. And we certainly worked hard to get to yes in there and really came to the conclusion that it was something we could do, safely by putting, trail up by the fence and having some sort of barrier. Certainly there's always challenges in that space and the safety perspective.
Director, may I interrupt you for one moment? So committee, that last bill was the last Minerals Committee interim bill. And because we have the time, we've been assigned a number of other bills. This one from the Transportation Committee came out of the interim. And as much as I chaired that committee and is responsible for their workload, I offered that we would take some of their bills to help them out. So that's the reason this bill is before this committee. Okay. Thank you, Director. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second challenge that we had in this space was as state parks works to put trails onto the system, which is what they do, and that's their business. As we work to support that, what we discovered was there are vehicles, there's requests for our roads as state highways to become part of the trail system, which makes a lot of sense again, in terms of connecting a trail here, a trail there. There's probably a road that's gotta be connected. And we see counties and we see other really counties putting their roads into the system. What we see as we look at putting our roads onto the trail system is that there's vehicles that are getting onto our system that are not appropriately licensed, not appropriately equipped with safety equipment. That's not in this bill. That's in a separate bill that's on the Senate side. So we won't talk that today, but that's another one of the concerns that we're working through that we think there's an easy fix for. And then the third challenge we had was really perpendicular runs to the interstate. So as you think about the original purpose, the original discussion we had with state parks in terms of this space, it was a parallel run along the interstate. But as we work this further with state parks, what we discovered is right now it is currently against the law for an off-road vehicle to even perpendicularly cross the interstate in a grade separated way. So you could have the interstate rolling along the top and you could have a road underneath it, which could be a county road. But because it penetrates vertically the space of the interstate, not authorized currently by law. And so what you see is the need for us then to modify the law to put in a separated grade crossing. And that's currently in the bill as we talk. However, we do think that we'd like to clean up that language and have submitted an amendment in concert with state parks to clean up that language. Really, with that, Mr. Chairman, what I say is, we've worked hard over the last 2 years with several committees, with our friends at state parks, and with other senators and representatives and economic leaders across the state, but specifically in the Southwest, and really are working to really support that endeavor. With that, I think maybe it'd be helpful for Mr. Glenn maybe to talk about his program a bit, and then we'll turn it maybe with your permission to Mr. Rossetti to walk through the bill if you so desire.
Sorry, Mr. Glenn, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. You have heard this ad nauseum, and I apologize. for being in
Mr.
this-
Glenn, this committee has not. I have, but the committee has not.
Yes, thank you. Dave Glenn, Deputy Director of Wyoming State Parks, Cultural Site and Cultural Resources. This kind of came to light a few years ago, and I'm not going to steal Mark's thunder because I know he's in the back and will probably speak. But the Southwest Off-Road Trail System gave us a call. And we said, we're tired of people driving by Evanston with all the quad runners on the backs of their trailers and side-by-sides, and they just drive right by. We want to create a destination for people to come to Wyoming and spend time. And we're not talking the hardcore four-wheel drive, Moab type stuff. This is just existing trails and routes that are there right now. And we want to kind of connect communities together and to the Uintas and to the Wyoming Range and kind of connect to historic sites, the Piedmont Kilns or Fort Bridger, and kind of connect them throughout. And we need help kind of working through the federal bureaucracy of how to do that. And so we started working with them and helping them. And our state trails program, that's what they do. We have 40,000 miles of enrolled routes on our system in the state, and about 1,200 miles of enrolled trails. And I want to clarify the difference of that because we are only talking about routes at this point in time. Trails are usually the 60-inch wide trails, think the top of the Bighorns, where you go up, you camp. Kids can ride those trails. If you have the little sticker that you purchase, kids can get on those trails and ride those on an OHV. Adults can as well. We're not talking about that piece here. We're talking about enrolled routes. Enrolled routes, you have to have all of the things you have to have when you have a vehicle on a highway or on a county road. You have to have lights, you have to have brakes. As Director Reiner was saying, we're going to kind of tweak that a little bit in the Senate to make sure it's very clear on that. But you have to have a valid driver's license, you have to have insurance, you have to have all of those things. That's what we are talking about on this piece. I'll be very quick. I also want to thank Director Reiner and YDOT because they have been phenomenally helpful and supportive on this, trying to get to yes. One of the things we said when we went to the Transportation Committee is we are not going to come forth in front of the legislature and ask for a perpendicular crossing on a freeway unless it's the last resort. Unless we look at, we're trying to connect 1,000 miles of trail here, 500 miles of trail here, and we've got to get under that freeway to be able to do that. That's our job. We go through that criteria. We look at the routes. We look at the safety of the people that are using it. We look at the resource. We look at all those things and say, okay, this kind of makes sense. And the whole idea on this bill is then we would go to YDOT and go, can we do this in this area? They have the absolute say to say no. They're the pros. They're the safety gurus. They're the ones that look at it. But there may be times that they look at it and go, yeah, it's a dirt wash and it's totally fine to drive underneath there. It's fenced. We'll put a speed limit on there. Then we would go back and enroll those trails. And when a route, when those routes are enrolled, that then allows groups, counties, federal agencies to reach out to us to ask for money for signage, for maintenance, and for those types of things as well. And I'll probably just leave it at that because I know that there may be some questions and the gurus are over here to the left of me.
Questions for Mr. Glenn? Questions? Okay. No? All right. So, Mr. Rossetti, before you start, I'm going to take a brief privilege here and ask the committee if you would look at page 2, line 1, or I'm sorry, line 7, section 1, where it talks about the amended statutes. And again, I'm just trying to bring you up to speed with how bills are written. If you notice, it says C, a separate C, and an E. Then if you go down to 31.5, 124C, you won't see A or B because they aren't being changed. So if you want to know what's in A or B, you have to go look at the statutes. Okay? Then if you go over to page 2, we're into 31.5, 1601, and it starts again with C because that's the first section that is modified. Then it moves to E. So if you want to know what A, B, D look like, then you have to go and look at the statutes. And this is for edification for the new people. And if you look under E, then you go down through all the multiple subsections. And the small little Roman numerals, the I and double I, are referred to as Romanettes. So if you hear those terms. So with that, Mr. Rossetti, proceed, but I do have a question for Mr. Gillette. You're not in the beard group now at YDOT?
Mr. Chairman, no, sir. I'm trying to be a little different.
Okay. So the mountain man look is not your thing. Okay. Mr. Rossetti, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Taylor Rossetti, Support Services Administrator at YDOT. And I do credit Mr. Tesoro and the folks behind us that had the vision that actually probably got this bill in front of you guys. And that's really the economic development or potential of this bill. I have the unfortunate task of being the regulatory side of this, so I think I'll be explaining to you guys the operation of vehicles and regulation of vehicles on the highways portion of this, but we're doing that in support of the potential economic development here. So I think as you hear testimony after us, you'll really probably start to put together why this is actually a very good committee for this bill. I do want to take you back through 40 years of history in about 30 seconds, just so you sort of have an idea of how we got here. We're talking about off-road recreational vehicles. So those vehicles were designed to really not be on the roadways from the very beginning. The legislature in Wyoming back in 1984 started to allow four-wheelers, the traditional straddle four-wheelers, to be registered as motorcycles. That was valid until 2008. In 2008, the MPV law came to be known. That was really, if you guys remember, and you guys probably are all aware of this, but the side-by-sides really started to come out. So at that point in time, we started registering things as MPVs. Then in 2020, the legislature added the dirt bikes, which were motorcycles that were not designed for use on the highway. So the legislature has, over time, started putting some more types of vehicles into this space. There's also a couple of terms. There's a definition that's in this bill that I'll cover with you, but there's 3 terms that I did want to cover before we get in here. The definition of highway that's commonly used in this section is really right-of-way fence to right-of-way fence. So think that's everything between fence to fence. Roadway is actually the improved surface. So think the blacktop or the bladed section of a county road that's gravelled. So that's the roadway. And then Deputy Glenn covered the definition of the Wyoming Off-Road Recreational Vehicle Trail. And the only reason I bring that up again is I think that word trail can cause for some confusion, but that trail actually includes, means an off-road recreational vehicle trail, route, road, or area specifically designated. So that's a pretty broad category. And as Deputy Glenn mentioned, you have your traditional trails that are, off the beaten path that anybody can be on. What we're talking about here, though, as the deputy mentioned, is routes or the actual roadways. So that's kind of how we got here. Mr. Chairman, with that, I'd certainly go into the bill if that would be your preference.
Please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for covering section 1 there in the bill there on page 1, line 7. We will be in Title 31, Chapter 5, which again is the regulation of traffic on highways. And there's 2 sections we're opening up. So there on 10, we open up 31.5.124, which is the off-road recreational vehicles, multi-purpose vehicles, and the limitation on use. This is really one of the main reasons we're here. And what we're doing there on line 14 is entering in the concept of the roadway or right-of-way of an interstate. And that'll become apparent as we get through here. So that's being very specific of how we may be able to introduce these onto those interstate rights-of-way. They are currently prohibited within this section as well as 1601 from being on the right-of-way in an interstate. And as the chairman mentioned, you don't see that here in this bill because we're not amending that section. We're actually amending different parts. So I bring that up and I appreciate your explanation of that, Mr. Chairman. So we're trying to modify that exception or disallowance to allow these in certain instances. That's what we're trying to achieve here. That carries on over then into page 2, lines 1 and 2, where then it brings in that same kind of exception into 1601. Then further there on page 2, we move into the actual operation on the highways. And again, highways is fence to fence. So just always try to keep that in mind. So this is the definition in this section that I did want to read to you. And I apologize for reading to you, but I think it's important as we go. As used in this section, the public road right-of-way means the entire right-of-way of a street, road, or highway within Wyoming, including the traveled portions, banks, ditches, shoulders, and medians of a street, road, or highway, except as provided in E of this section. So again, that's going from the very broad, but then trying to funnel us down to this narrow thing that we're trying to deal with here today. Moving on to then page 2, lines 13 through 17. We're again talking about the defined off-road recreational vehicles, which is found in 31.1.101A XVK. There's a lot of Romanettes in there. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Those vehicles shall not be operated on the roadway or right-of-way of an interstate highway, except as authorized by the department rules and except that an off-road recreational vehicle under this subsection. So again, that is where you start. Current language says you cannot do this. We're modifying that language so under certain conditions we may be able to do this. We start getting into what those exceptions may be then on lines 19 through 23, where we get into Romanet I. And what we're doing on Romanet I is we're talking about the actual parallel route potentially being in that interstate right-of-way. This is the example that the director brought up when he was talking about that 3.5 mile segment that's outside of Evanston that really kind of brought this to light. So this Romanet I is really about that parallel route and kind of the conditions under which that might be able to happen. And if you look, the important parts, I think, of that paragraph are there probably on line 21. The beginning of that line talks about a physical barrier. So that means that if we're going to do this, we're going to have to physically separate that from the rest of the highway. That potentially could be a fence, or it may even be Jersey barrier. It's going to be very dependent upon what is required to be able to safely do that. So that's that physical barrier piece. That's to keep the off-road recreational vehicles from veering off this route onto the paved surface of that interstate and interacting with traffic on a live interstate. So that physical barrier, I think, is pretty important in this paragraph. Additionally, it goes on to explain that it has to be designated and signed, and that would be where the cooperation with us and the state parks group and the locals would actually come into play. As Deputy Glenn mentioned, what they would be looking at here is you have a section of trail over here and a section of trail over here. You've got to run this little bit of a route in the interstate right-of-way potentially to connect those two sections. So we're not just going to be out there building these routes within rights-of-way. It's going to have to make meaningful connections, and we would do that in consultation and collaboration with the state parks group. Moving then on through the rest of page 3, we do have the stipulation that, again, because these things are really on a highway, because they're between the fences, we are stipulating and making clear that the driver of that vehicle must be properly licensed, and that they either have a license plate, which is the MPV plate, or the off-road recreational sticker as defined in the state parks program. So that's really the bill. Mr. Chairman, if it's appropriate now, we could talk through the proposed amendment as it addresses lines 12 and 13 on page 3, or I could certainly wait.
Mark, go ahead and pass that proposed amendment out. So committee, any questions for any of our wonderful panel? Representative Western.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rossetti, so forgive me for being a little slow on the uptake. The problem is that we have two major trail systems, and the only way to get between those two trail systems is to kind of, certainly what I've done up in the Bighorns Mountains, where you just get your four-wheeler, drive on a little on that two-track, a little bit of ways, then go off into a different trail system. That's the practice now, where this creates a clear path for them to be connected in the safest, kind of regulated way possible. Is my understanding correct?
Mr. Rossetti?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Western, this is very specific to interstates. The practice that you described on a two-lane highway or a county road is really the practice now, but they are explicitly prohibited from being anywhere within the right-of-way fences on an interstate highway. This is very specific to dealing with the barrier that the interstates create for these systems.
And so, follow, Mr. Chairman?
Proceed.
And so the only way to connect these two, I guess, very desirable, sought-after trail systems by some of these ATV enthusiasts is to have this kind of mechanism so that they can connect through these, through the right-of-way of the interstate, correct?
Mr. Rossetti?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Western, yes, we do believe that this is probably a last resort, as Deputy Glenn may be able to testify to, but you're absolutely right. This is what would be required to connect those two things legally.
Representative Heiner, I think you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rossetti, we've had some discussion this morning in testimony about routes and the designation of a route. And now in the bill, we're talking about trails. And I want to make sure I understand the differentiation here. If we get the right nomenclature, or, should we be calling it route or trail? I want to understand that a little bit better, please.
Mr. Rossetti?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Heiner, thanks for the question. Earlier on, that was the reason I did try to take us through that definition of what the Wyoming off-road recreational vehicle trail can mean. That word trail can be synonymous in this context with a road, a route, or an actual physical trail. I do believe for the purposes of this bill and the folks that are administering the programs, I think the nomenclature is correct. It does take a little bit of explanation if somebody has a question.
Any other questions? Other questions? So committee, you'll find this with the Department of Transportation. They bring a whole crew with them, and then Mr. Rossetti's the only one who really says much. I have to have some fun with my previous chairmanship, and that transportation deals probably specifically with Department of Transportation and Department of Military Affairs. And the reason for that is WYDOT is the largest state agency, has the largest budget, by far the most employees. So we give them some extra care and consideration and oversight, and they take a little bit of good humored abuse from the chairman. So, okay, no other questions? Okay, with that, I will open it to public comment, and I will ask Senator,
Mr. Chairman, I think.
Director,
if- with
we
your
need to go
permission
through the, I'm sorry, we need to go through the proposed amendment. I apologize. Thank you. Mr. Rossetti, see how that works?
Mr. Chairman, I figured that was your subtle way of telling me to stop talking, which is fine. I'm going to take you guys really quick back to the bill, page 3, lines 12 and 13. And this talks about the perpendicular crossings that Representative Western even talked about. So this is where something goes over or under those interstates. And I think as worded there on lines 12 and 13, it still left a little bit of area where in a circumstance, somebody may try to actually cross the road surface of the interstate. And we want to make it very clear that that's not what we're trying to do here. So I did propose an amendment, and you guys have that before you. And what we do in that amendment is we go up on page 3 on line 10 after 312704 and end that sentence. So I strike the semicolon and the word and. I then delete C in order to address the crossings here in Romanet 2, as you see before you. And what that wording says is may be operated on separated grade crossings over or under the interstate roadway. So again, I was intentional on the words I used there. I wanted to make it clear that you're not going to drive on the surface. You're going to either go over it or under it. And I used the term roadway there so it was clear that that's what you're doing. You're trying to cross the roadway, not necessarily the entire rights of way, because you'll leave the right of way at a different point off the trail. But I was very intentional in the wording I used there. And then I used the same language you saw in Romanet 1, where it talks about that these things would be marked and signed as a Wyoming off-road recreational vehicle trail. And again, that word trail is there, Representative Heiner, pursuant to the statutes, Wyoming statute 312701 through 707. And that is the off-road recreational vehicle section or chapter of statutes. And then we bring in the same conditions that if you're going to be crossing there, you'll be crossing with a licensed operator as well as either with a plate or an ORV sticker. And that's the amendment as I propose it to create the two scenarios. Romanet I is parallel, Romanet II is actually perpendicular or over or under crossings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions for Mr. Rossetti on the proposed amendment? So, okay, I do have one question, Mr. Rossetti, and we talked about it before in transportation, and I believe there's a bill out there on insurance and that sort of thing, and certain requirements for off-road vehicles. They come in under separate sections, if I remember right. Correct me if I'm wrong. So if that bill passes, then they would in effect also require that off-road vehicles maintain a minimum amount of vehicle insurance. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, you are correct.
Okay, so that is not necessary to put that in this bill.
Mr. Chairman, I believe through the working in the interim, there was the belief that it was not germane to this bill. So that's why you see two bills.
Okay, thank you very much. Committee? Okay, thank you. I'm going to call on Chairman Dockstetter, President Dockstetter. I'll get it straight someday because I know they are gaveling in at 9:30. I think we're a little ahead, but I want to give Chairman Dockstetter the opportunity to speak on this. And for those of you who will meet Senator Dockstetter, he is chairing minerals on the Senate side. Thank you, Senator, for being here.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your consideration on the time. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we are in full support of this bill and the entire project. We put a lot of work into it from the regional concept, folks. You went to Sweetwater, Sublette, Lincoln. We think we have a good plan to bring together a tied-in trail system, but we need to link in, as this bill specifically notes, on some interstate highway to bring it all together. I've personally been out and visited the site. We have an opportunity here to make what I view and what I hear from folks. We got a safe connection out there. But overall, as you look at this, what this opens the door for, these are the people that have the discretionary funds that come in here. They actually bring their recreational vehicles in enclosed trailers, and they cost a lot more than my pickup. And they get out and they travel these roads and these connections, and they make a destination out of it. They'll stay in one community, use the hotels, enjoy the restaurants, the entertainment, all that goes with it. We're taking a further step in Lincoln County to work with the National Monument folks to get access to that. I think that will happen. I'm planning to make a trip out to our DC delegation after we get done with the legislative session to emphasize to them that we need to better utilize that national monument. It's a pretty quiet place sometimes. But if we could bring in these vehicles and these parties to use this and enjoy Southwest Wyoming, I think it's a real plus. This bill, Mr. Chairman, is just one step in tying it all together, and I appreciate the Wyoming Department of Transportation for working with us on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions for Chairman Dockstetter? Okay. Chairman, thank you. I know you have to get up on the floor, and we'll be seeing a lot of each other during the interim. Okay. Any other legislators? Yeah.
You can let me know if this is not appropriate or not, but I had a comment from a senator who has to be in session at 9:30. Can I convey that message, or is that not appropriate?
You can convey the message, but please don't read it. We avoid reading prepared things on the floor. So I'll let you just give us the gist of that. And I believe that was probably Senator Jones. Okay, please.
She just wanted to express her support of the bill and recognize the economic development impacts of this bill for our Southwest Wyoming region. So thank you.
Okay, so any other legislators? Come on down. Representative Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee. I just want to let you know that I fully support this bill. And I've been taking a lot of notes. I'm new to this. As you'll hear from Mr. Tesoro, they've been working on this a long time. I've listened to it, but I understand what this is going to do, especially as a side-by-side user and a person that has, and can I be truthful, Mr. Chairman? I didn't know that there was a law that you couldn't drive underneath the interstate. And in Evanston, we have a lot of interstates and a lot of open land where we hunt, and we have some access areas where we can ride our side-by-sides. And I too have used that, and I didn't know I wasn't supposed to. And now this, and it wasn't because I was driving for the scenic part. I was driving and accessing that for the hunting part, just to go from one area to the other, because it was right on the Cole Road exit where it was. And I've only done it like twice in my life. So I apologize for that, sir.
The troopers in the back will appreciate your honor. No, I am joking, Representative.
So anyways, as a side-by-side or an ORV enthusiast, and knowing many people in Southwest Wyoming and many people in surrounding states that do this, thank you for putting this together. And thank you to the departments and Mr. Tesoro for putting all this together. It's been a lot, and many of the representatives. And two, obviously, the economic value is huge, and it's going to be amazing, because I see it all the time, how many people drive to our corner of the state loaded with their side-by-sides and loaded with those vehicles, and the clubs that they do, because they want to access, they just want to access, like the Piedmont Kills. They want to see what's out there and what Wyoming has. That's the history. They want to see maybe the markers of the pioneers, which are some of those stones, the gravestones that they're out there on those trails and along the paths of the Mormon Trail and also the Oregon Trail. And those are out there, and you can see them when you go, and it's more and more convenient and access for these people. And third, again, back on the subject of what these agencies have done. Mr. Tesoro started this in the Economic Development Board. He was like, here I am. I don't know what to do. And they just come up with ideas. And this is from his personal idea. Does anybody have any ideas about how we can grow economy in our, and he just sat there and he told me, we see these vehicles. What can we do to get them to stop in our communities and visit Southwest Wyoming and spend their money, right? And this is a vision. And he found out through this process, what a cool way to connect people, connect agencies, connect representatives, connect our economic developers, our mayors, our committeemen, all of that together. We've connected this, okay? And we've used a lot of people, and it's been an awesome thing to see. I'm just barely diving into this, and I can't wait to start using these routes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Berger. Okay, any other legislators? Okay, any other agencies? Anyone from the governor's office? Okay, anyone else in the room? Mr. Tesoro.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman
Good to
Burkhart.
see you again, Mr. Tesoro.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Good morning, committee. My name is Mark Tesoro, and I am the president of Southwest Wyoming Off-Road Trails, also called SWOT, S-W-O-T. SWOT is an economic development project for the communities of Southwest Wyoming. Just over a couple years ago, I took this idea to the Economic Development Commission in Evanston. I asked them what they thought about it, gave this same presentation that I'm talking to you about today. They said, why don't you put together a working group and see if you can get something off the ground? This really is a way and a project with a goal of connecting the communities of Southwest Wyoming with a series of off-road motorized trails. This would be a way to get people into our communities so that they could come in, spend money in the communities, stay at a hotel, gas up at a convenience store, eat at a restaurant, and then travel from one community to the next and see all that there is to see in the history of Southwest Wyoming and the areas that we have. Points of interest, historical sites, and of course the beauty that there is in the area. The plan started originally with Senator Schuler. I approached her very early on, and her late husband. He, of course, was with the Forest Service and had retired, but had been with the Forest Service for 30 years. And in the Forest Service, they had about 350 miles of trails. And I said, Rick, what do you think about this? Connecting what you have in the mountains with the communities that are 20, 30, 40 minutes away. Can we do this? And he said, absolutely. I've wanted to do something like this for many years, for 20 years, but could never find the right partner. So the three of us, Senator Schuler, her husband, Rick, and myself put together a working group and started approaching city councils, county commissions in Uintah County, just to say, how can we connect the forest to the communities and see all the sites in between? I did approach Senator Dockstader. I knew him through newspapers. I approached him in early 2020, and I said, what do you think of this, Senator? Could we connect what we're doing down in Uintah County with what, with Lincoln County? And he said, we have a small trail system in North Lincoln County, and we would love to get on board and connect with what you guys are doing in Uintah County. And so from there, it has grown to this project that you see today, with involvement from state parks and state outdoor rec office, state trails, of course. And it really is an opportunity to look at bringing revenue into the state in a different way. People that have lived in Wyoming all their lives have talked about diversifying the economy, finding ways to bring money into the state. And this is maybe an unconventional way, but it also has great potential. With the downturn in oil and coal and natural gas, and you heard the testimony from Mr. Obermueller this morning. Absolutely, oil and coal and natural gas are the number one revenue driver in the state. The number two revenue driver is tourism and recreation. And what better way than to use existing assets to bring people into the state and spend their money. This is really nothing new in our surrounding states. In Idaho, in Utah, especially southern Utah, in South Dakota, they are doing trails projects like this and have been doing it for decades. We just don't have something like this in Wyoming. Once we were able to get the county commissioners and the Evanston City Council on board, then other communities started hearing about the project and wanting to get on board as well. So the communities of Mountain View, Lyman, LaBarge, Marbleton, Big Piney, Kemmer have all signed MOUs with the State Trails Office to allow these vehicles to come into their communities. I've also given presentations to communities of Pinedale, Rock Springs, and Green River, and they are on board with it as well, pending legislation. They want to be able to access these trails. What we're talking about this morning, for example, in Green River, in order to access the Wild Horse Scenic Loop, you have to travel underneath the interstate. There's a well-paved road it's a major road that goes right underneath there, but you have to be able to travel underneath the interstate. There are places where the state right-of-way is very close to traffic. When you're talking about the state right-of-way and the public right-of-way in communities, in downtown Big Piney, in between Lyman and Lyman and Fort Bridger, there are walking paths that are right next to those state highways. Those are walking paths, biking paths. So the state highway is used for many purposes throughout the state. And we would like to use that to make some of these connections as well. This is not necessarily saying that anybody wants to ride an ATV or a side-by-side from Kemmer up to Pinedale on pavement. They buy these vehicles to ride them on dirt. They want places to ride, so we just have to make some of these connections possible. Bear River Drive in downtown Evanston is a state highway. You have to be able to drive on Bear River Drive to get out of town to the trail system. The nearest county road is 3 miles away. So that is the impetus for trying to work with WYDOT and with State Trails in order to make that 3-mile connection happen. Some places, and this was brought up last year, but some places it's 100 yards or more away from the interstate. If you carve out a 15, 20 foot section of trail inside the highway fence, you're not taking away anything other than making some connections happen. Some of the stakeholders that we've had to the table on this project, of course, are city councils, county commissioners, Forest Service, the BLM, Game and Fish commissioners, officers, and biologists, chambers of commerce, the Weed and Pest Division of the Department of Ag, nonprofit groups like Muley Fanatics, Tread Lightly, and Wyoming Wildlife Foundation, of course, local business and local industry, law enforcement, including Highway Patrol, sheriff's offices, and of course, our great partners at WYDOT and the State Trails Office and State Parks. We would not be where we're at today unless we had those state agencies on board. So I'm grateful for Director Reiner and for all of his work with his team on this project. Director Westby, Director Glenn, and of course, Forrest Kaminga from the State Trails Office. And of course, legislators is the other component as well. Senator Dockstader has been at many of these public meetings with me. We were in Kemmer at Kemmer City Hall last week. Senator Schuler, Senator Baldwin, Representative Ayer, former Representative Ayer, Representative Heiner, former Representative Banks, and former Representative Marshall Burt have been at these city council and county commission meetings with me to help push this project forward. The counties of Uinta, Lincoln, Carbon, and Fremont have all enrolled their county roads into the State Trails program. When we talk about economic benefits, we don't have to look farther than our neighboring states to see some of those benefits. In 2019 and 2020, the state of Utah and the Off-Road Vehicle Association, OHV Vehicle Association, listed that there was a 20%, there was more than a 20% increase over the ski industry. So they're bringing in 20% more than the ski industry for OHV use and trails in Utah. In Garfield County in southern Utah in 2019, there was a $33 million economic benefit to that county alone from OHV trails. The opportunity is there. It's a tremendous driver for something new that's in the state. And everybody knows how big snowmobiling is in Wyoming, how much of an impact snowmobiling is and has been for many years. And this is really a little different than the snowmobile industry because typically snowmobiles are one machine and one rider. But we're talking about machines now that can hold a whole family. This is really like boating on dirt. And we're creating a scenic byway for these people to come and ride. You can fit 4, 5, 6 people. And if you can access the communities and spend the money, that's where the economic benefit comes from. Somebody asked me early on if we, as SWAT, were going to be creating campgrounds and parking areas. And really the answer is no. These are opportunities for entrepreneurs and business people in these communities to look at it and say, hey, there is suddenly another 40 people showing up in downtown Fort Bridger. Maybe I should open up a hot dog stand or a rental shop.
Mr. Tesoro,
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up your testimony. We have other people who want to provide it, and I want to clear this bill from my docket
Thank you, sir.
before we get out of here, and we
Okay.
gavel in at 10. So if you could, please.
Absolutely. I've given these presentations from 10 minutes to 2 hours, so I'm very familiar with time constraints, and I appreciate your time. I would stand for any questions and just look for your support. The Transportation Committee worked on this throughout the interim last year, throughout summer and fall. I was in this building in November, on November 3rd, in front of Transportation, and that passed out of Transportation in a 13-1 vote. And I would just ask for your support and to continue this project. I'd stand for any questions. Thank you, Chairman.
Questions for Mr. Tesoro? Any questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Tesoro. Mr. Winnie, I believe you wanted to speak on this.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Please
Bill Winnie,
proceed.
Sublette County, one of the counties earlier mentioned as people were testifying. I have a Polaris Ranger MPV Crew 900. Have an MPV sticker or plate on it, a ORV sticker. I use it for transportation a lot out there. A year ago, a similar bill I spoke against because I didn't think an MPV had any business on or near an interstate. I look at what Director Reiner and his people have done, and I feel the safety portions of that are adequate, and I therefore support the bill fully. I would note the amendment proposed about grade crossing, or the verbiage is important. As I read the language, without the amendment, it would allow an MPV to cross at grade. That would be a risk to being squashed like a bug. Subject to your questions, thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Winnie? Questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Winnie. Anyone else in the room?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, David Fraser, Executive Director, Wyoming Association of Municipalities. I'll be very brief.
Thank you.
I just wanted to thank the committee for considering this and urge your passage of this bill. I wish I could claim to have done some of the heavy lifting on this, but I can't claim that. But I do recommend those that did the heavy lifting on this. I love what the directors said about getting to yes. Walt Disney famously said the answer is always yes, and then he added the caveat, sometimes it's yes if. And you can see the yes if in this bill. I think everybody's always thought it was a great idea, but there were some safety concerns, and I believe that they've been adequately addressed here. And the length of this bill certainly does not indicate the work that went into it. My final comment is that although I would represent to you through WHAM statewide interest in the passage of this, although the Southwest Wyoming was first in on this, and we'll take first advantage of it. I believe there'll be other opportunities in other areas of the state as well. So again, I urge your yes vote and stand for questions.
Any questions for Mr. Fraser? Mr. Fraser, thank you. Kelly, I believe we have two people on. If you would admit Mayor Williams from Evanston. He's not? No. Okay, how about Mr. Thack? Okay, you'd admit him? Okay. He hasn't raised his hand? Okay, then I'm going to move on. Any other testimony in the room? With that, I will close public testimony. Committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Heiner, seconded by Lawley. Okay, go through the bill. Any comments first? Representative Conrad.
No, Mr. Chairman, did you want to go through the amendment first?
No.
Okay.
We'll get to that when we get to page 3.
Briefly, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is an incredibly important opportunity for all of us, specifically in Southwest Wyoming, having been part and in full disclosure as a member of the Uintah County Economic Development Commission. This is an unbelievable opportunity. Over 60 years ago, a gentleman by the name of Eisenhower created what's called the Highway Act. I look at Mr. Tesoro in the same light. He's had the opportunity some 60 years later to connect a great opportunity for us in Southwest Wyoming for the economic development. As mentioned already, I just want to reinforce and more importantly promote this passage and your favorable consideration. It is incredibly important to me personally, but also for our constituents in Southwest Wyoming, as well as the county of Uintah County, and also state of Wyoming. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other comments? Okay, so go through the bill. Page 1. Page 2. Page 3.
An amendment.
Representative Larson.
I move to make the amendment that it has, as proposed, page 3, line 10, strike the semicolon and insert the period. Page 3, strike lines 12 and 13 in their entirety. And page 3, line 14, insert may be operated on separated grade crossings over or under the interstate roadway, marked or signed as a Wyoming off-road recreational vehicle trail pursuant to Wyoming statute 31-2-701 through 31-2-707, provided the off-road recreational vehicle A is operated by a person with a valid driver's license for the type or class of vehicle being operated. B, display a license plate pursuant to Wyoming statute 31-2-232 or an off-road vehicle recreation vehicle decal pursuant to Wyoming statute 31-2-702 through 704.
Okay, seconded by Lawley. Any discussion on the amendment? And Representative Larson, it's just appropriate to say the written amendment as proposed by the department. You don't have to read the whole thing. So, okay, question on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Amendment is adopted. Any other discussion? Question being called. Mr. Knotts, would you please call roll on House Bill 62, off-road recreational vehicle operation, as amended?
I believe it's House Bill 42.
42, I'm sorry, correct? Thank you.
Representative Banks,
Aye.
Representative Conrad,
Aye.
Representative Heiner.
Aye.
Representative Knapp,
Aye.
Representative Larson,
Aye.
Representative Lawley,
Aye.
Representative Tarver,
Aye.
Representative Western, Representative Chairman Burkhart.
Aye.
Ayes are 9, noes are 0. The bill passes with amendments.
Okay, House Bill 42, off-road recreational vehicle operation, sponsored by Joint Transportation, has passed Minerals Committee as amended, and Representative Berger will carry this bill on the floor because it is a Transportation Committee bill. And the previous bill, 62, Representative Western is going to handle that because that was kind of his bill. So with that, we have a few minutes to get to the floor. Thank you, committee. We are